Not many game franchises get me quite as giddy as Driver. Something about these games, even a lot of the ones that aren't that widely well regarded, just really do it for me. With the heavy, tail-out, hard-to-handle muscle cars, the ultra-challenging, just-made-it missions, the cheesy soundtracks, and the cutscenes that make nods to classic cinema while riding the line between corny and stylish, Driver games just click together to get all my brain chemicals firing. And to celebrate Driver turning 20 in June of this year, join me as we take a closer look at the birth of the series and the legacy it left behind. It can be easy to forget that this game did indeed have a legacy. Driver was huge when it landed on the PlayStation in 1999. It sold well over 3 million copies, sitting comfortably among the PS1 greats sales-wise, and critics adored it, keeping in mind that review scores were more harsh back then, but it's never quite as referenced to or widely remembered as its PS1 contemporaries like Spyro or Tony Hawk or Tomb Raider. And I think that's a goddamn travesty, because Driver is amazing. Sliding big 70s muscle cars around iconic American streets to some funky beats while getting in massive police chases plays just as cool as it sounds, as if it were an old Hollywood car chase movie. Driver really wears its cinematic influences on its sleeve. So for this video, and for this occasion, I actually went back and watched some of these influences, starting with the 1968 Steve McQueen classic, Bullitt, which features what I've been told is one of the most iconic car chases in cinema history, and I can see why. This whole scene is wonderful, with its roaring engines, its screeching tires, and the beautiful cars against an equally beautiful 60s San Francisco backdrop. There's a real practical nature to it too. You can really feel how heavy the cars are as you see the suspension struggle with each bump and jump. The shaky shots from inside of the car really hammer home that this is a rough and tumble, realistic chase. And this very physical, very weighty feeling is something that Driver captures effortlessly. Acceleration is pretty slow compared to most driving games, you easily lose traction while turning, and if you're not good, you're gonna slide these oversized lumps of American metal into every wall, car, tree, and pole that you see. Because of the way the game is programmed, the only type of corner that you'll come across is a 90-degree right-angle turn, so every map is sort of a grid in a way, and the handling is in some ways designed around this. When you approach a corner, the most efficient way around it is to manage your speed coming up to it, and then quickly pull the handbrake while turning to sort of slingshot your car sideways, and with enough planning, skill, counter-steering, and a tinge of luck, you'll fight your way back into actually gripping the road without smashing into anything. That feeling that Driver captures of being somewhere in between full control and spinning out is just wonderful, and this heavy, screechy car handling is uniquely Driver. If you've played one of these games, you know exactly what I'm talking about, as it sets the groundwork for why most of this series really is fun, going all the way up to Driver San Francisco in 2011. And speaking of San Francisco, smooth segue, one of Driver's 4 surprisingly large open world cities is San Francisco, no doubt thanks to Bullitt, which features alongside Miami, Los Angeles, and New York. It's worth pointing out just how much of an achievement pulling off 3D open worlds like this was on the PS1. I find that the Driver series usually gets unfairly compared to GTA a lot, but I'll make an exception now because at the time GTA was still a weird top-down thing when this first Driver game came out, and GTA 3 was over 2 years away. So the modern open world city style that's super popular today was barely in its infancy, and Driver pushed the envelope forward like no other game before it. Part of its wide appeal was no doubt thanks to this open world novelty, and I'm sure that novelty wearing off is part of why it's not as widely talked about these days as some other PS1 classics. Reflections Interactive is the name of the company that developed this, and they started with a string of mostly successful home PC releases in the 80s and early 90s before they would find themselves on the PlayStation with the first 2 Destruction Derby releases. While not hitting the same highs sales-wise as Driver, these did both make it to platinum for being bestsellers, and I actually really enjoyed them as a kid, not knowing that they were made by Reflections. In hindsight, it makes complete sense that they are, because they aren't your typical racing games. With some unusual game modes, they rewarded, as you can probably guess, destruction. At the time, they had both a cutting-edge simulated physics system and cutting-edge car damage models, so it's not hard to see how Driver spawned from these games, not only because this tech was carried over, but also because of that outside-of-the-box thinking when designing a racing game. It's so outside of the box that Driver straight up isn't a racing game. It's not like your open-world Midnight Clubs or Need for Speeds, because you don't actually do any street racing here. Instead, you play as NYPD detective named Tanner. Like Steve Steve McQueen in Bullet, he's your classic archetypal, aloof, hard-boiled cop.
Truth is, Tanner, 3 years on the department and you're still the best driver I got. We don't get too many ex-racing boys in here.
If you remember anything from this game, you probably remember the first level. Set in a small underground car park, you're undercover, which seems fitting given the location, and tasked with impressing some gangsters with your smooth moves by doing everything on this list within a very, very tight time frame. And it was frustrating as all hell as a kid. I have this distinct memory of sitting in my family room with all my cousins passing one of those PS1 controllers without the analog sticks around, as we all tried to beat this very first mission. I think we all learnt what slalom meant that day. I've read and heard multiple tales of people just giving up on Driver's story mode just because of this mission, which I think is hilarious. Like what an unfriendly way to open a video game. The common misconception is that this is the tutorial to the game, but it actually isn't intended to be. It mirrors a scene in a film that the driver imitates more than any other, the 1978 Walter Hill neo-noir cult classic, aptly named The Driver. I'm sure you can guess how that meeting went. The driver sees the lead character, who's also simply named The Driver, impress some gangsters by pulling off some smooth maneuvers in a car park as an initiation to see if he's a good enough wheelman for a getaway job. He uses the opportunity to intimidate the gangsters and wreck their car, but otherwise the parallels here are unmistakable, especially when coupled with everything else in the film. So while this mission kind of naturally acts as a tutorial because it's the first level, there is a real training option that's accessible from the main menu that will actually guide you through the controls and how to play. Instead, this level is the game just challenging you to prove yourself as worthy enough to even play it, because you'll need to be that good. And don't get me wrong, it's a pretty awful way to start a game by any conventional standards, but there's definitely a charm to it.
Maybe I'll give you a call when I need a ride to the grocery store.
Prepare to suck at this game in 4 different cities. As an undercover getaway driver, you're often finding yourself in high-stakes police chases with cops whose tenacity can only be compared to the ones in the Blues Brothers. These guys will just smash into everything in their path and destroy the whole city just to smash into you. They are relentless, and the slightest traffic infringement will set them on their brutal tirade. Police chases are such a fight for survival in this game because if you wreck your car, which is deceptively easy to do, that's game over, and checkpoints are rare. That constant volatility is always playing on your mind, which means you really need to drive near perfectly a lot of the time. Each scratch bumps up that damage meter, which is just making things harder for yourself and ramping up the tension. You'll need your car to be in as good a condition as possible for all the times that you'll inevitably get rammed by the police. This is something that's pretty unique to this first game too when looking at the series as a whole, as all the other games let you switch cars on the fly, whether that be on foot or as an ominous supernatural floating eye. And if the fragile vehicles weren't stressful enough, the constant timers on everything ramp it all up to 11. Between all the chasing missions and the tailing missions and the missions where you're getting chased or the simple A to B missions, there's a fair chance you're being timed and it's balanced against you. Even if you survive an onslaught of bloodthirsty police, you still might not make it in time, and it can be incredibly frustrating. Believe me, Driver is not a game for everyone. But that rush you get when you complete a mission knowing that you had to drive near perfectly to only just make it in the nick of time is amazing, and part of why I think this series is so good. It's just such a pure skill-based driving game that's simple on paper and exciting in execution. You truly do have to be a good driver to get anywhere in this, and I know that'll sound kind of gatekeepy to some of you, but if you're determined enough, it's super rewarding. Unfortunately, the story that should be backing it up is also simple on paper, but flat in execution. More of a victim of its time than anything else, these primitive 90s pre-rendered cutscenes are shockingly awkward, with stilted animations and weird delivery while somehow being both basic and hard to follow. It's a stark contrast to later games in the series, which handled their storytelling far better.
You know the Gold Rush Hotel, Mojo?
Damn, man! Hey, the treads! Watch the treads, man!
It's a shame because it could be really cool, and we know it can be really cool because it is really cool in the later games in the series. You're basically playing as Steve McQueen in Bullet, going undercover as a wheelman like the driver in the driver. But thankfully, that's not to say the game isn't filled with atmosphere and character. The opening garage cutscene is somehow actually pretty cool, unlike literally all the others, and it's another homage to The Driver with its opening credits. That movie also took place in a lot of hotel rooms, so the game uses different hotel rooms in each city as a more immersive version of a mission select screen, where you select missions by listening to their briefings on an answering machine, and depending on which missions you choose, the game sometimes splits off into multiple paths, which gives it some replayability. And the cities themselves, while they might not look like much, pack in some good ambience too. Leaves fall from the trees, pedestrians wander the streets, and the rain effects in particular are very ahead of their time, complete with lights reflecting on the road, and those lights have a really cool Akira-like trailing effect. I also really liked how your hubcaps were always flying off your car, which is again something both movies we've covered do too. With the hotel rooms, the gangster stories, and the visuals, there's a certain gritty vibe to the game, but on the flip side, there's also some really great, cheesy, groovy music and funky title cards going on here, which can't be traced back to Bullet or The Driver. Instead, we must look to the small screen. Now, I didn't go back and watch all 93 episodes of Starsky and Hutch, but I do remember seeing some of it on TV growing up, and I watched a lot of the show's highlights here on YouTube, and I was taken aback by just how similar Driver is to this aesthetically, even down to the color grading. Combining practical, screechy city street stunt driving with lovable, corny funk music is something both the game and the show revel in. Fittingly, the second most infamous level in Driver behind the first one is the last one. Continuing the corniness, this mission sees you simply driving the US president from one side of the city to the other, but the police think you've kidnapped him, so they're chasing you, and the game's thrown in these sinister black cars that I think are meant to be the Secret Service. Now, up until this point, the game has always been very challenging, and you've needed to rely on luck at least a little bit at times, which added an extra layer of excitement, but you just get the feeling that for the grand finale, the developers were just like, screw it, let's make the most unfair level ever, and they did. It's pretty much 100% luck, like whether you beat this thing. The mission essentially has you driving like in a straight line, but the president's car is so slow and the barrage of rammings would be hilarious if it weren't so frustrating. It's just unbelievable, like what a mission. And that's where Driver ends. There is a simple free roam mode, which I'm sure a lot of you spent most of your time with this game, crashing into things and getting in police chases, and then there are some challenges like going through cones or seeing how long you can survive a police chase. And if Driver wasn't enough of a love letter to Hollywood already, there's this very in-depth replay editor where you can set up cameras and direct your own Hollywood chase scene. I loved this feature as a kid, and like the open world itself, it's super ahead of its time. Something like this would work way more now with all the social media sharing stuff, yet here it is in 1999, and it's surprisingly good. Everything in Driver just clicks for me personally. Everyone has certain games that feel tailor-made for them, and I'm sure you can think of yours right now, and this is one of mine. You might hate Driver, and that'd be perfectly understandable, but of course a lot of people loved it as the game went on to sell like crazy and start an entire franchise. I think playing it today, I'm just most amazed by how well it still sets the bar for driving in one of these open world city games. Driving in this still feels better than pretty much all of your Grand Theft Auto 5s or Watch Dogs of the world. Where it's more of an afterthought there, they've made a really fun game out of it here, and I wish more open world games these days would realize that driving itself can be more exciting than anything else, instead of just an annoying way to get from point A to point B. Driver's PC port would release in October of 1999, which naturally also sold gangbusters, being the 42nd most sold PC game in the US between January of 2000 and August of 2006, which is kind of crazy if you think about what games came out in those years. The port itself tinkered with the soundtrack and visuals a bit, not necessarily for the better, but it's still a really good port, and it obviously runs a lot smoother, though I'm sorry to say that I'm not sure how it goes on modern hardware. In April of 2000, Driver actually got a Game Boy Color port that attempts to translate the game into a pixely top-down version, and if memory serves correctly, it does a surprisingly good job at it. It's definitely something for another video. Then Gameloft remade the game for iOS in 2009, but it isn't available anymore, which kind of sucks. I had it on my Gen 3 iPod Touch back in the day, and I almost finished it there, and I do remember it being pretty faithful and pretty well done, though obviously the touch controls are about as lame as you'd expect. It's worth pointing out that Driver spawned a wonderful community that mostly congregates in the Driver Madness Discord and forum, with speedrunners and modders and fans of the game still holding out for the series' return. They've even started making a publicly playable fan game called The Driver Syndicate that recaptures the physics and energy of this first game really well. It's impressive stuff. Links are in the description. And of course, it wouldn't be long before Driver would see its first sequel with The Extraordinary Driver 2. Releasing less than 1.5 years later in November of 2000, Driver 2 would feature such pleasantries as curved roads and being able to get out of your vehicle. Subscribe to stay tuned for a Driver 2 retrospective as we go through this series to see what went right and what went wrong. Hope you enjoyed this video. Hope you're having a wonderful week or day or weekend or whatever you're doing. I'm completely off script now, if you can't tell. I really want to recommend the movie The Driver. Like, look it up. It's really, really interesting. If you like the movie Drive with Ryan Gosling, that takes even more notes from The Driver. It's kind of like Drive of the 70s. So we end up having The Driver, Drive, and Driver all being related in some way. But yeah, I really, really enjoyed it. It's directed by the guy that did The Warriors, so it kind of has that same New York nighttime vibe and energy that I really, really enjoyed. I didn't like Bullet as much as the internet and the world and Hollywood seems to, but I really, really loved The Driver, so I recommend looking it up. And yeah, I want to thank my patrons who make this show happen. You all are wonderful, including the patrons, but not limited to, the ones coming up on the screen, and especially including my $5 tier patrons: Adam Beals, Analog Man, Boggy Online, Caden the Dingo, Chef, Devin Grandal, Dominic Chikoki, Evil Chicken, Gary Pay, Casey, Labcat Letherington, Lucas Ray-Sevic, Mattias Bayes, Maximilian Kunzman, May Aris, Mazaki, Melanie G, Minimi is a J2ME powered flip phone in a handsome man suit, Mrs. Minimi, Mustache Duct Tape, OK Got Food Sunny, Peaceful Kumquat, Plague, Ritalin for Kids, Tanin Azami, Tio, Test Drive Unlimited 2, The Mighty Mega Link, Thomas Damsgaard, Tommy Carver Chaplin, Traplaw Ross, Trixie Emerson, Under 10 Hours, Writing on Games, and Zindictive. Y'all are wonderful. Thank you for supporting. Thank you for watching if you've made it this far. And I'll see you all in the next video. Take it easy.